quick warning before we start. Tonight we're talking about free speech, context, and how quickly narratives get built and enforced online, which means referencing public backlash, viral clips, and how people get judged on fragments instead of full intent. This show is not about harassment, threats, or dehumanizing anyone we disagree with. It's about slowing the moment down and asking a real question. When context decides guilt, who gets to define that context? We'll challenge ideas and double standards, not people, and we ask you to listen through the whole conversation before making up your mind. If you're ready, let's get into it.
We don't live in a world where people ask what happened anymore. We live in a world where people fight over what it meant. A few seconds of video hit the timeline, the outrage machine spins up, and before anyone slows down to ask questions, judgments are already locked in. Intent becomes irrelevant, context becomes optional, and explanations arrive only after reputations are damaged. The rules aren't written, they're improvised in real time, enforced unevenly, depending on who you are and which side you're on. Tonight isn't about relitigating one halftime show, one clip, or one headline. It's about the system underneath all of it, the one that decides when speech is acceptable, when it's problematic, and when it suddenly requires punishment. Because when meaning gets rewritten after the fact and context becomes a moving target, free speech stops being a shared right and starts feeling like a trap you don't know you've stepped into until it's too late. All right, let's bring in the crew. Brian is here, never shy about calling out double standards and selective outrage, especially when the rules seem to change depending on who's speaking. Rachel joins us as the independent voice in the room, focused on intent, fairness, and whether principles are being applied consistently or emotionally in the heat of the moment. Daniel is with us too, pulling at the threads behind the headlines, from algorithms to enforcement to who actually benefits when meaning gets rewritten after the fact. And Skylar rounds out the table, bringing a progressive lens to the conversation, challenging power structures, raising concerns about harm, and asking whether free speech conversations leave room for accountability and real-world impact. 4 perspectives. 1 uncomfortable question. When context decides guilt, who's really in charge? All right, let's get into it. Over the last few days, we've watched the same pattern repeat itself again. A moment gets clipped, shared, and instantly assigned meaning before anyone pauses long enough to ask basic questions. Not what happened, but what are we supposed to think about what happened? And that's where this gets dangerous. Because when interpretation outruns intent, and outrage outruns facts, free speech stops being about what you say and starts being about how it can be framed after the fact. So tonight, we're not arguing about whether people should be offended or not. We're asking who gets to decide what speech means once it leaves your mouth and hits the internet. And Rachel, I want to start with you. Rachel, when we talk about free speech becoming context dependent, do you see this as people genuinely trying to be more thoughtful and considerate? Or are we watching context turn into a flexible weapon that gets applied differently depending on who's speaking?
I think this is one of those situations where the intention and the outcome have drifted far apart. On paper, caring about context sounds reasonable. Of course, words matter, and of course, history, tone, and impact matter too. But what we're seeing now isn't thoughtful analysis, it's retroactive interpretation. Context isn't being explored, it's being assigned, often by the loudest voices or the fastest headlines, and once that narrative sticks, there's no real appeals process. The problem isn't that people want accountability. It's that accountability is being enforced selectively, emotionally, and often without consistency. What worries me most is how quickly intent gets dismissed entirely. We've moved into a space where it doesn't matter what someone meant, only how a clip can be framed to fit a broader narrative. And once that happens, speech stops being a conversation and becomes evidence. That's a big shift, because free speech used to assume good faith until proven otherwise. Now it assumes guilt unless you can survive the outrage cycle. That doesn't create understanding. It creates fear and self-censorship, especially for people without power, platforms, or institutional protection.
Yeah, and that last point is the key for me. This idea that context is about care sounds nice, but in practice it's become about control. Because if intent no longer matters, an explanation is considered an excuse, then speech isn't judged on principle. It's judged on outcome, optics, and who benefits from the fallout. And once speech becomes evidence, not expression, you don't need laws to suppress it. You just need enough outrage and selective enforcement to make people think twice before speaking at all. That's not accountability, that's conditioning, Which brings me to you, Daniel. And Daniel, if context is now something that gets assigned after the fact, who do you think is actually doing the assigning? Is this organic public reaction, or are algorithms, platforms, and institutions quietly steering which interpretations survive and which ones disappear?
Let's stop pretending this is organic. It feels organic because it's fast and chaotic, but the velocity is engineered. Algorithms decide what you see first, what gets boosted, what gets framed with labels, and what quietly disappears into digital purgatory. That means the first interpretation people encounter often becomes the accepted reality, and by the time nuance shows up, the verdict has already been delivered. We don't live in a town square anymore. We live inside curated feeds designed to reward emotional reaction over slow thinking. Outrage spreads because it performs well, not because it's accurate. And here's the deeper layer. Institutions watch that reaction and then respond to it as if it's unanimous public will. Corporations, media outlets, universities, they don't want risk, so they treat viral interpretation as fact and move accordingly. That creates a feedback loop. The algorithm amplifies a take, institutions validate it, and then the public assumes that validation proves correctness. That's not free speech being debated. That's narrative formation in real time. And once narrative formation becomes automated, context isn't discovered. It's selected. Now, I'm not saying there's a guy in a dark room pressing a red button labeled "Ruin this person." It's more subtle than that. It's incentive structures. Platforms profit from engagement. Media profits from outrage cycles. Institutions profit from appearing decisive. So the system doesn't need conspiracy. It just needs momentum. And once momentum starts, it doesn't ask what someone meant. It asks what version of the story travels fastest. That's who assigns context now. Speed, scale, and whoever benefits from the first draft of the story sticking.
Daniel, that right there is the part people don't want to admit. It doesn't take a secret meeting in a back room. It just takes incentives. Speed beats accuracy. Emotion beats nuance. And once that first version of a story gets traction, everything after it feels like damage control, even if it's the truth. What bothers me most is this idea that silence now equals guilt. If you don't respond fast enough, you're hiding. If you respond too fast, you're defensive. And if you try to explain, you're walking it back. That's not a fair system. That's a trap. And here's the dangerous part. When algorithms amplify outrage and institutions validate it, average people start thinking that viral equals verified. We've trained ourselves to believe that scale equals truth. So now context isn't something we uncover. It's something we inherit from whatever trend line got there first. Skylar, let me bring you in here. If algorithms and outrage cycles are shaping interpretation, how do we balance that with the very real concern that speech can cause harm? Is this just narrative manipulation like Daniel's suggesting? Or is some of this pushback a legitimate attempt to protect people from real-world consequences?
I think two things can be true at the same time. Yes, outrage cycles move too fast, and yes, algorithms reward emotional reaction over context. But we can't ignore that words do have impact beyond intent. The historically harmful rhetoric has led to very real consequences for vulnerable groups, and that's why a lot of people are more sensitive now. When someone hears language that echoes something that's been used against them before, their reaction isn't manufactured. It's rooted in lived experience. So the instinct to push back isn't always about control. Sometimes it's about protection. Where I think we run into trouble is when harm becomes assumed instead of demonstrated. There's a difference between speech that directly incites harm and speech that makes someone uncomfortable. Those lines get blurred online because everything feels urgent and amplified. And when institutions overcorrect, they can create the very distrust we're talking about. If enforcement looks selective or inconsistent, people stop believing it's about safety and start believing it's about politics. So the balance should be this: defend free speech as a principle, but don't dismiss impact outright. The real challenge isn't choosing between freedom and accountability. It's making sure accountability is evidence-based and applied evenly, not just triggered by whoever trends first. If we lose that balance, we don't just lose trust in platforms, we lose trust in each other's ability to speak honestly without being immediately assumed malicious.
Skylar, I actually appreciate that framing because this is where the conversation usually falls apart. You're right. Words can have impact and history matters. But here's where I push back. If harm becomes a feeling instead of a measurable threshold, then enforcement becomes emotional instead of principled. And once enforcement becomes emotional, it becomes inconsistent. And once it becomes inconsistent, it becomes political, whether anyone intends it to be or not. That's where people lose trust. Because look, free speech was never meant to protect comfortable speech. It was meant to protect controversial speech. The whole point of the First Amendment wasn't, you can say things that don't upset anyone. It was, you can say things even when people don't like them. Now, that doesn't mean speech should be reckless or cruel, but it does mean we can't let outrage redefine the boundaries in real time. If the line moves every time Twitter trends, then nobody actually knows where the line is. And that uncertainty chills speech more effectively than any law ever could. So, Brian, let me bring you in to close out the panel round. If context is being assigned by speed, algorithms, and emotional reaction, do you think this is accidental cultural drift, or is there a broader ideological push happening to redefine what free speech actually means in practice?
Let's stop pretending this is random drift. Culture doesn't just accidentally move in one direction for a decade straight. What we're watching is a slow redefinition of the concept of free speech itself. It used to mean protection from government punishment. Now it's being reframed as protection from government punishment, but open season for social, corporate, and institutional punishment. And technically that's legal, sure. But culturally, it changes behavior just the same. What's happening is ideological enforcement through soft power. You don't need to arrest people. You just need to make examples of a few. Public shaming, firing, demonetization, deplatforming. The message spreads fast. Stay inside approved boundaries. And the boundaries are always shifting. That's the key. If the rules were consistent, people could adapt. But when yesterday's acceptable joke is today's scandal, that's not evolution, that's instability. And instability benefits the people who get to define the standard. Now here's the kicker. The same people arguing that context is everything are often the first to ignore context when it doesn't serve their narrative. We've seen it over and over. Clip it short, amplify the worst interpretation, demand immediate consequences. That's not about protecting people. That's about power. And when power gets to decide meaning, free speech stops being a right and becomes a privilege you hold until the wrong crowd decides otherwise.
Brian, what you just said is what makes this conversation uncomfortable. Because it forces people to admit that punishment doesn't have to come from the government to be effective. You don't need a law on the books if you've built a culture where people police themselves out of fear of social exile. And that's the part I keep coming back to. When speech becomes something you measure against the mood of the moment instead of the Constitution, you haven't technically lost your rights, but you've definitely lost your confidence in using them. And here's where I land on this. Free speech was never meant to protect popular speech. Popular speech doesn't need protection. It was designed to protect controversial, messy, imperfect speech, the kind that sparks disagreement and forces debate. But what we're watching now is a shift from debate it to define it and punish it. Context used to mean understanding what someone intended. Now, context often means reframing what they said into something more damaging than they meant. That shift may feel subtle, but culturally it's massive. If context becomes fluid and enforcement becomes selective, then free speech isn't being debated anymore. It's being managed. And once it's managed, the question isn't, is this allowed? The question becomes, who gets to allow it? That's a very different country than the one we're supposed to be living in. So here's the bottom line tonight. The issue isn't whether people can react to speech. They always could. The issue is whether we're letting speed, algorithms, and ideological momentum decide what speech means before we slow down and evaluate it honestly. Because if context is assigned by whoever trends first, then truth doesn't win. Volume does. And that's a dangerous place to be. We're going to step aside for a quick merch drop. And when we come back, I've got a few final thoughts about what protecting speech actually requires in a culture that rewards outrage over reason.
Before we get into final thoughts, let me remind you, if you believe in speaking freely, thinking independently and not letting the loudest voice in the room dictate what truth is, that's exactly why Data and Dissonance merch exists. We've got the full lineup live right now. Hoodies, hats, mugs, bumper stickers, and the Gen X gear that says what corporate media won't. And yes, the coffee blends are still moving. High Lakes, light roast for the early thinkers, Rock Creek, medium for balanced perspective, and Bitterroot, dark French roast for those long late-night debates when the world won't shut up. Roasted in the USA, shipped straight to your door. Because if we're going to fight narrative battles, we might as well do it caffeinated. And remember, every purchase doesn't just support the show, it supports independent media. No corporate overlords, no network leash, no approved talking points. Just this mic, this table, and the willingness to say what others won't. Grab yours at Data and Dissonance at printify.me. Now, let's land this thing the right way.
Here's what I want to leave you with tonight. Free speech doesn't die all at once. It doesn't collapse in some dramatic headline moment where a switch flips and suddenly it's gone. It erodes quietly, through social pressure, through institutional overcorrection, through a culture that rewards outrage more than understanding. When people start calculating every sentence not based on truth, but based on how it might be clipped, framed, or weaponized later, something foundational shifts. The right technically still exists, but the courage to use it shrinks. We've reached a point where context isn't something we patiently uncover, it's something we race to assign. And when interpretation becomes more powerful than intention, we start judging people not on what they meant, but on what benefits the loudest narrative in the room. That's not a healthy information ecosystem. That's a reactive one. A mature society should be able to hear something controversial, investigate it, debate it, and respond proportionally. Instead, we escalate first and clarify later, if we clarify at all. And every time that cycle repeats, trust drops a little further. Protecting free speech doesn't mean protecting cruelty. It means protecting the space for disagreement without immediate exile. It means applying standards consistently, not emotionally. And it means resisting the urge to let speed and scale define truth for us. Because once we allow trending interpretation to outrank thoughtful analysis, we're not defending ideas anymore. We're defending reactions. Slow down, think first, question the framing, and remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. Because if you like conversations about power, truth, and what's really happening beneath the surface, you'll love these books. Start with The Covenant Protocol, where secrets aren't just hidden, they're protected. Then move to the Prophet Directive, where information becomes a weapon and loyalty has a price. And get ready for Book 3, Black Echo Rising, where the lines between intelligence, influence, and survival blur in ways that feel a little too real. If tonight's episode made you think about narrative control, power structures, and who really decides what's true, these stories take that tension and turn it into pulse-pounding fiction, available now on Amazon. And if you want the full Data and Dissonance experience, check out the album Uncaged, streaming anywhere you listen to music. Independent voice, independent stories, independent production. We'll see you tomorrow.